What's up everyone, Dr. Q here, and I thought I'd make another video. Yes, another one, and it hasn't been 5 years. What do you think about that? And what I want to do is kind of go over your comments. Something that I always used to enjoy YouTubers doing was engaging in a conversation with their audience. And I thought that since I have a bit of time, I'd do that. So let's go ahead and see what some of you have got to say.
Please get a better microphone, please.
All right, so I don't like going out. Whenever I go, I get distracted. But let's go ahead and get a better microphone, I guess. I'll be right back. Alright, so I'm back after all this time. Let's go ahead and get to it, I guess, to your responses. And Titanium Tomato says, I agree, Hellblade cannot be dismissed. I guess thanks for that approval. And there's a really long conversation that kind of stemmed from that comment. Finally, someone mentions Hellblade. Extra credits, bait and switch, and this is just, people agreeing with each other on how, Hellblade shouldn't have been dismissed in the original extra credits video. We have a comment from Just a Guy saying, I would argue that Hellblade isn't just a great example of how games can be made cheaper, but it's an interesting point. And he kind of elaborates on what he says. He talks about how YouTube personalities covered the game, and that's essentially free promotion. So you don't need the $100 million budget to make a game, and etc. But he argues at the end that he can't get behind a 4 to 8 hour game with no real repay value being worth $30, and I guess that's a fair position, but I would disagree with that, and so would other people, it seems. Hellblade was a very good, unique game. He said it's severely overpriced. Again, I'm not sure that it was overpriced. $30 bucks. Let's think about what we can get for 30 bucks, right? We can go to the movies, and that's like 2 hours of enjoyment. A video game, gets you, if it's Hellblade, 6 to 8 hours. So, I guess if you are considering your bang for your buck, how much time you're going to get out of Hellblade or games like it that are, on the shorter end of the spectrum, you might feel like you are getting a bad deal. But I guess that's just difference in perspective, right? To me, what would make a game worth it is not how much time of engagement you can get from the game, but rather how immersed you become in the game's world, in the game's lore. So for example, games like Portal, Portal 2, Super Hot, Firewatch, Journey, all of these are pretty short games. Far Cry 3, Blood Dragon, Bastion, they range from like 2 to 10 hours. Mirror's Edge, and they range in terms of cost anywhere from, I don't know, like $10 to $30. And those games seem to me a better investment than something like No Man's Sky, right? It's No Man's Sky is a beautiful game. It has an amazing aesthetic, but it's really repetitive. And even though you can spend, I don't know, 70 to 100 hours completing the main story of the game, and even more than that, if you want to repeat it over and over, it's not as impactful as, for example, Journey, Flower, or any of these other shorter games. So I would have to disagree that short games are not worth $30. Now, if the argument were that they're not worth $60 and that's overpriced, yes, I can absolutely agree with that. I don't think anyone would want to play Journey if the cost for entry was $60. But for $20-$30, that seems fair, especially since if you get the physical edition, you get other games along with it from the same studio. And Hellblade really is quite an experience. So I wouldn't just discount it because it's not long. Let's see. Shadow Rose says that if the AAA industry wants to argue that games are too expensive, they should open their books and show us line by line total cost. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I'm a fan of transparency, but there are certain things that we would need to take into consideration when it comes to competition, the markets, the way that markets work, trade secrets, and so on. I'm not so sure that it would be a good idea, for example, for Sony. Well, this is how much we paid each of our coders. This is how much we used in licensing Havoc, for example, for physics, or this is how much we spent on creating the Decima engine, or whatever the case might be. Even though it might be good for industry research, I'm not so sure that there would be a point outside of some kind of, internal audit. Unless, of course, a company were to get into some kind of legal issue, and then the books would really need to be opened up, but that's a whole other question. Now we call them extra AAA credits. It's a funny jab at them. Everyone has seen the poor Republicans. A lot of games are too cheap. So here we're talking about Activision Blizzard. And they do come into conversation, but this comment I don't think warrants really going into analysis of Blizzard's economics and how much it costs for them to make games. But he's basically trying to make a point. Let's see what people notice that extra credits is disingenuous with most of their stuff. Their ideologues, alright. So I'm not sure that extra credits is disingenuous with most of their stuff. The idea of being disingenuous, right? Like what that term means is that you're trying to be insincere, right? That you are not being fully honest, that you're being coy, that you're pretending to not know as much as you actually do. And so for this video, absolutely extra credits is playing coy, or was playing coy. This was like 2-3 months ago. So hooray for timeliness. Extra credits really made it seem as if they were not really sure how the AAA market works, and trying to make all these false equivalencies. Whereas in the rest of their videos, they do have an agenda. If you want to call that being an ideologue, sure, but everyone has an agenda in their own way. They have an agenda. They are pretty much straightforward about it, and in most of their videos, they put on an air that they do know what they're talking about, and they do. They're quite knowledgeable about games, the gaming industry, etc. It's just that when it came to this one argument, it was very poorly crafted, as I talked about in my previous video. Let's see. Someone says, wrong, it was 7.2 million. We're talking about the cost of the game. He's saying that my estimated cost of 9 million is too high because you need to take into account 30% for every $30 purchase on Steam, on the PlayStation Network, etc., etc. So by Red Sea Gaming's estimation, The cost of production for Hellblade was actually 7.2 million instead of 9 million. Which, thanks for that bid. I had totally forgotten about that, but like I said, more information is always welcome, and I did make them purposefully high, right? I was trying to give extra credits the benefit of the doubt, basically. Let's see. In short, Naomi says publishers are greedy and they just want to multiply their investments. Yes, most companies do that. Hello, Bonavie side, Bovine side. You person, I got a better microphone, so hopefully this works. Let's see. Babylonga says that Hellblade can't be dismissed out of hand, but it's not necessarily an alternative to normal AAA because they, meaning the studio, make it clear that they are an independent AAA studio. And so those kind of games would be smaller in budget by definition. But that we essentially need to be more nuanced, and that it's not valid to call extra credits disingenuous for trying to explain how these companies tend to operate. I do agree there is a lot of nuance to game development. I disagree in that I was calling extra credits disingenuous for trying to explain how these companies tend to operate, but rather that they were being disingenuous in the way that they framed their argument, the way that they were putting up false equivalencies, saying things like, well, people want really good AAA games like Horizon Zero Dawn and Zelda Breath of the Wild, when the conversation was actually about loot boxes in EA games, right? So that's a false equivalency. It's switching the object of conversation from one type of a AAA game to another type of AAA game. So that's what my video was commenting on, not necessarily on just showing on extra credits showing how these companies operate. Let's see. Ignore the government, could be AAA. Argue Prison Architect, and then when addressing it, they say it's a fluke. So there's a comment on extra credits videos. Prison Architect, I'm not sure that you could say that that one's AAA, because when we talk about AAA, there's an implication there that a game looks and feels and plays a certain way. And if we look at Prison Architect, right, as fun as the game is, it is an incredibly fun game, and as compelling as the experience is, it is one of those immersive games that I mentioned earlier. You could group Prison Architect along with Journey, etc. in terms of how it makes the player react and feel. It's lacking a sense of aesthetic that comes with what we call AAA game. Those like super high definition assets, etc. But yes, I do agree with Commander Vex's take on extra credits logic. Let's see, Manly Spirit says, he has a question. Everyone's negative about loot boxes. What about the indie dev who does not have millions of dollars to make a game? Would it be fine for them to make loot boxes? Would it not be a better alternative to Kickstarter? And the answer to that, honestly, is it depends. My issue with loot boxes is not so much that the AAA industry is using loot boxes, but that loot boxes are being exploited, or rather that gamers are being exploited through this kind of aggressive push for more and more loot boxes, for a focus on essentially having platforms in which the player buys loot boxes, right? So an example of an indie that has I don't know, something like ethical DLC. I think is Brawlhalla. Let's go ahead and put that here. This is a really interesting fighting game that you can download for free. You get the first, I think it's 3 characters, and if you want to get other characters, you can buy them, or you can buy the Founders Pack and you unlock all of them. And the Founders Pack, I think it's like, $50 or something like that. And then you can buy loot boxes to get different weapons and skins for the characters. And these skins don't change the play experience at all. They just have different looking characters. So you can have one of the superheroes, instead of looking like a barbarian, he looks like a Viking, or he looks like Santa Claus, or he looks like whatever, right? So if you get something repeated, you either get credit or you get a chance to re-roll. I can't remember which one it is right now. But it's not a game in which the player is expected to continually buy loot boxes so that the game can be enjoyed. Unlike, Star Wars Battlefront or the Shadow of Mordor orcs, etc. Shadow of War orcs, sorry. Let's see. Using a simple example, it's not a case study, it's an anecdote. No. An anecdote is a story, and so an anecdote would be, this is the Hellblade development. A case study is when you look at one thing, one object, one instance, and analyze how it worked. I admit that my video is not what you would call a scholarly piece of work. If I were to write a full case study about Hellblade, that would probably translate into a 2-3 hour long video. But using it as an example in a broader argumentative context is certainly valid. And my argument is not contingent on Hellblade by itself, but rather on a broader psychology of games approach, if you will. Hellblade is just one point of the broader argument, right? One case study that can be used to support the argument against loot boxes. And that indeed demonstrates that you can make high quality games with high fidelity visuals without having to spend $100 million. And so there are some other examples of games that don't cost $100 million to make, right? Found a list on not my favorite website, but it's fairly comprehensive list of AAA titles from 2014 going back all the way to ET, and I'll go ahead and link that down below. It lists Watch Dogs as having cost $68 million to make, including marketing. Let's see, it lists Beyond Two Souls. That is an amazing game built by Quantic Dream. That costs $27 million to make. So it's still fairly high. Most of us probably won't make that much in our lifetimes, but it's not $100 million, and it did fairly well. Borderlands 2 cost around $30 million. Papo y Yo, that's an amazing game. That one's an indie game, but it does have that kind of HD aesthetic, high definition aesthetic that you expect from AAA games. That one cost $1.5 million. That was confirmed by the director. Right, so in this list you can find several data points that show that you don't need $100+ million to develop a game. fact, it's very likely that most of the money actually goes in marketing, but that's just speculation. Let's see. Someone else said, I don't really like the way that you word extra credits defending predatory practices. Just today they released a follow-up video. So yes, they do have a hand in the AAA industry. Doesn't make them happy with predatory practices. That it is correct that they do have a hand in the AAA practices, and that doesn't mean that they're happy with the way things are. In fact, I do think that extra credits has done a lot to prevent the AAA industry from becoming even more predatory than it currently is. But again, we're talking about this one particular situation regarding loot boxes, in which they're basically saying, hey, it's okay because they need money. And there are other more ethical ways in which AAA publishers, by their own admission, can make money. They don't need to rely on kind of predatory loot boxes that are mostly based on gambling mechanics and psychology research. Hellblade did have less marketing than GTA, Call of Duty, etc. So this statement here is correct. But I'm not so sure that the difference in cost between Hellblade and, say, GTA, which has a development cost of over $100 million, Call of Duty, Battlefront, etc. I'm not so sure that the difference in development minus marketing is, like $90 million. Marketing does not cost $90 million. Here he's talking about how the best kind of microtransaction is cosmetic. I could not agree more. Do I support cosmetic loot boxes? It depends. If you get some kind of repeat item and you can sell it back for some kind of premium currency or for another cosmetic item, etc., that would be great. Let's see. And then just talking about his experiences with gaming. Let's see what else. The existence of outliers does not mean that there isn't an average, etc., etc., and that is absolutely correct. Okay, there we go. I never said that the average AAA studio project is Hellblade. That is correct, and then he kind of engages with the conversation, so I'll just leave that comment there. I really like that the audience here is kind of engaging respectfully. It's not the kind of stuff, flaming wars that you'd see in other videos, maybe because it's kind of a smaller channel. So let's see. Hellblade is not a AAA game, that is correct, or AAA quality. I would disagree with that, and we'll revisit this statement in a little bit. It's a middle market game that did a lot of innovative MO stuff with the video editor and so on and so forth. He's saying that it's a walking simulator and so on. I think that there is an assumption here in Karen's comment that AAA means open world, or I'm not really sure how you are defining AAA. It's not AAA. Hellblade is not AAA in that it was not published by a AAA studio, right? Meaning EA or Activision, Blizzard, etc. But it is AAA quality if you consider, again, the visuals of the game. So if you compare something like Hellblade, the way it looks, versus something like Horizon Zero Dawn, clearly a AAA game, and the way it looks, you can see that there is a level of quality that both games meet, right? They're just about the same high level of fidelity, and the combat system, while not as fleshed out As Horizon, for example, it looks impressive. It feels heavy, right? It actually reminds me a bit of that one game where you choose like samurais or knights and then you fight for honor. That's the feeling that I get when I play Hellblade, combat-wise. The weapons feel heavy, they feel like they hit. It doesn't feel like you're just pushing a button. But you know, the point of this was not really to defend Hellblade, but rather to engage in conversation with you guys. So I'm going to stop just talking about Hellblade and just discuss the issues themselves, I guess. Let's see. No, what about Hellblade's not a AAA game? We're talking about a game called Alex. I'm not familiar with that game. Let's go ahead and do a Google search for Alex and see what that game looks like. Oh, that looks really impressive. Alright. And so this person says that Alex was made by a small team. Let's go ahead and... this looks really cool. I think I might put this in my to-play list. Once I'm done with Monster Hunter, I'll get to this. The question I think would be how much did it cost to make? So let's cost of... I don't think I can find any data here as to how much it costs to make. But we do know that it was made by a studio called Piranha Bytes, and Piranha Bytes, according to Wikipedia, has 30 employees. So and it's the same studio that made Risen and Gothic. I'm familiar with Gothic, though I haven't played many of the titles. I have played some of the Risen games, so really good. And you know, I guess this person's comment does stand that it was made by a small team. This was State of Decay. You know, so you can have these really good games be created by small dev teams, and perhaps even by a single person. And I'm going to show you an example of a game that was actually developed by just one individual and looks amazing in a little bit. Once I'm done going through everyone's comments and kind of getting back to y'all. Right. And Kinosker asks if Extra Credits did a false equivalency. Yes, they did a version of the false equivalency. It's not as extreme as the ones that you see in formal debates, especially when they talk about things like order of magnitude. I actually remember reading in a paper once someone comparing things like the Deepwater Horizon to, you know, someone spilling oil that they changed from the car into the faucet, and you know what, that oil that you drip into the faucet, it doesn't really harm the environment. So you know, when you get like a massive gas leak, well, it's not really that bad because the oceans can clean themselves up anyway, just like we have plants. And so you know, there's like a really big difference between you know, putting a little bit of oil down the faucet, which you shouldn't do, and like a massive gas leak in the middle of the ocean, right? So what Extra Credits did is not to that extent. But yes, when you're talking about AAA games that have loot boxes and use them in a predatory manner, specifically, right? It's like Shadow of War, and then you compare that to a game that does not meet that criteria. Yeah, that's a bit of false equivalency. Right, and so Not Todd Howard says, I don't always agree with Jim, but he's right about this. He talks about brick and mortar stores and how distribution costs make up to 40% of the cost, but now in digital downloads, games are still $60. That actually reminds me of something that I used to say, and I still stand by. I'm a big fan of physical copies. I like holding my game in my hand, and I don't think digital distribution offers that many benefits other than having all the games already in the console. So I guess if you just want to like switch games at the click of a button, that's really the only benefit that I've ever seen. And a lot of people made the argument that no, game prices are going to go down exponentially because you don't have distribution costs for brick and mortar stores. So you know what's happening to Steam is the same thing that's going to happen on the PS Store, and so we've seen that's not the case. You still have like $60, even more so, right? You know, you go online, you go to the PS Store, for example, and it's like, hey, buy this new upcoming game, and you can get like the Golden Deluxe Digital Edition, whatever bullshit kind of thing, and it costs like $90, $100. It's ridiculous. Let's see. Here we have Gabriel Gallardo. He says Jim Sterling, which you believe to be a reliable source, the same guy who gave Hellblade, the game that you use as a major example, which is not a AAA game, a 1 out of 10. Just saying, right? So, giving games scores, it's like a subjective thing. Jim Sterling didn't like Hellblade, and that's fine. It's not a AAA game, that is correct. It was not published by one of the major AAA studios, but it is a AAA quality game in terms of visuals, play experience, etc., although not necessarily length. And I don't really think that Jim Sterling is especially a credible source. He's a game critic, he makes arguments, and sometimes I think they are somewhat correct, as is the case with this one. Sometimes I think they are completely ridiculous, like the time when he was talking about ludonarrative dissonance, which he discarded offhand. I happen to think that's a very solid lens through which we can analyze games if we take it seriously and apply it appropriately, not just talk about how, oh, this game is ludonarrative dissonance because it looks so pretty and it's violent, right? So that's not the way to do it, but we can make another video about that. Let's see, 1 month ago, should have waited a bit longer, Jim made a video response, and that's cool, like, I guess, but you know, lots of people can engage in conversation. I would actually encourage all of you to like make your own videos, engage in discourse. I actually never expected this video you know, to hit, what is it, like almost 4,000 views. You know, for me that's crazy. Usually I get like, I don't know, 10 views and 3 of them are like, you know, my wife or whatever, right? So this is amazing. So, you know, thanks for all of you who thought to stop by and look at my previous video. Let's see, this person says that Ninja Theory has 125 employees. Devs have multiple teams. A good size team can be anywhere from 20 to 250 people. Crytek has 14 people back in 2013. You know, so just kind of factual information, it seems, right? So thank you everyone for chiming in. You know, it was a great conversation, and hopefully for the next video we can engage in similar kind of productive discussions, right? So this has been Dr. Q. Have a wonderful day.